Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Mehta, CEO of Gainsight, and I'm so excited to have a conversation with Kyle Poyar from OpenView Venture Partners. Kyle's an operating partner at OpenView and has been a true thought leader in the world of product-led growth. We've been following OpenView stuff from the beginning. I think you guys were the first ones to coin PLG, or at least one of the first ones, right?
Yeah, my colleague Blake Bartlett gets all the credit for that one.
That's all. It's awesome, and you guys really have helped lead the way for a lot of us to think about growth in a different way. And so we're going to dive into that. But we always like to start every Gainsight thing with an icebreaker. So we'll start with the icebreaker for you. So I love reading. I'm kind of one of those annoying people who's always reading and asking people what they're reading. So I'll ask you, what are you reading right now?
I've been reading too much lately. I'm like obsessed with The Economist, and so
Oh,
I'm focused on doing things this summer. One
yeah.
of them is cooking, and so I guess my book, long story short, is Jerusalem by Otto Lengi, which I'm going to be. I've read before, but I'm going to be cooking a lot more recipes this summer.
Oh, awesome. It's called Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Yep, he's got 1,000,001 cookbooks, but Jerusalem is, I think, his best one.
Oh, nice. And is it all like Israeli cooking or?
Israeli, Palestinian, Syrian, just kind of
Cool.
the hodgepodge of flavors around the Middle East.
Awesome. Super cool. All right. I'm reading like two of the most opposite books you could imagine right now. Because I always do one audiobook and one print book. And so my audiobook right now is CEO Excellence. I just finished it actually. It was written by the folks at McKinsey, and they studied basically top CEOs and how do they spend their time. So how much time do they spend on, external interactions versus employees and things like that. Very, very interesting. And then on the far end of the extreme, I have a list of books that I was supposed to have read a long time ago, and I'm finally reading. So I'm reading Brothers Karamazov right now. So classic Russian literature and business books, like those go really well together, I guess.
Really great beach reading, either
Yeah,
way, right?
totally. Yeah, that sounds good. Awesome. So we're going to talk about product-led growth, and like I said, OpenView really helped kind of canonize the concept and also get us all thinking around a common framework. And OpenView also has some really cool new ideas about the next evolution of PLG. But before we dive into that, we got to start with the elephant in the room. I try not to check the stock market because it's painful. But when you do check the stock market, you notice that the numbers are a little different than they were, 4, 5, 6 months ago. Valuations have come down a lot. That's both for public companies, probably for private companies as well. And so I'm really interested to hear your view of how does product-led growth fit into the context of this new environment of funding and valuations?
It's interesting. I'd say folks right now seemingly overnight had to start thinking about efficiency. It was a growth at all costs as of 2 months ago, one
Right.
month ago.
Totally.
It's changed very quickly. And when I think about efficiency, the first thing folks do is try to protect the core, right? Make sure that they're retaining their existing customers. They have a plan for existing customers, and also the core in terms of core product initiatives, core
Mm-hmm.
investment areas. That's what stays. Anything that's experimental, unproven, takes a long time to see results. That tends to be the stuff that gets cut first. And so on the PLG side, I guess for me, anything that helps folks drive more retention, get better visibility into churn and their existing customer base, or anything that's around scaling an initiative that's already been proven, I can see folks doubling down on that. But the days of stepping into the PLG waters, if you will, which we've been seeing more and more of, I suspect that's going to decline a little bit, just because it's going to be one of those things that's unproven to a lot of larger enterprise companies.
That's a really good point because there's that sort of investment period where you're not getting the return from investing in PLG, but you're putting all the cost in terms of refactoring your product and restructure your team and things like that. Do I have that right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
But it's a good point though, because we'll come back to it. PLG means so many different things to different people. And there is a PLG element that's all about retention and driving customer value and things like that. Sounds like that's probably here to stay for most companies. And then you mentioned scaling up PLG efforts that are already working and just kind of making them bigger, which is probably a very efficient way to grow your customer base.
Absolutely. Yeah, the other way I think of it is a lot of folks, when they're looking at product trade-offs, they're looking at, hey, do I build net new features or do I build more efficiency, like more self-service, more automation, faster time to value? And I do think that that folks, as they're thinking more about efficiency, they used to be able to say, all right, we'll just hire more people, we'll throw more bodies on this. And I do think that product initiatives to improve more efficiency and reduce the services costs or time to implementation, I could see those certainly staying as well. They just become, they were already smart investments before, but they become especially smart investments as people are trying to be more efficient.
Efficiency is cool again. Is that basically the bottom line? I guess it's been a long time.
It went out of style for a bit there, but it's it's like the 80s. Somehow, keeps coming back in style.
You can't get away from it. Bell-bottom jeans and customer acquisition cost optimization. Okay, so let's talk about the history of PLG, because we've referred to it a lot. There might be some people watching who are just getting up to speed on it. And actually, you wrote this really cool kind of historical account of how we got to where we're at now. Can you give us the couple minute summary of how PLG's evolved?
Absolutely. Well, and it's fascinating to think. So, going back even 10 years ago now, there were companies doing PLG-like things. Like you could even think of Atlassian famously had no salespeople for the longest period of time. Slack has a true bottom-up freemium strategy. Evernote even was a kind of a B2C to B type of model.
Mm-hmm.
But all of these companies called themselves different things. They kind of invented their own growth playbooks. They were either freemium companies or bottoms up companies or consumerization of IT. There wasn't a consistent playbook for what to call this kind of growth or how to do it. And all the SaaS metrics and SaaS advice centered around kind of classic enterprise scaling. So like ratios between BDRs and AEs, or CAC models for landing new customers at the enterprise side, how much services cost you should have as a business. And at OpenView, my colleague Blake Bartlett actually even pointed out when we were looking at investing in Datadog, as we invested in their Series B, we saw that they didn't have an outbound motion, which means at the time they didn't have a way to spend money to make money. So not having an outbound motion was even seen as an investment risk rather than a sign that a company has really bought into PLG. And so it was at that point that we said, hey, these companies are doing something where they're outliers. So they're going against the grain, but they're seeing really great results. A lot of times these companies growing faster, they accelerated their growth rates at scale, and they were more efficient than other software businesses. And so we said, it's time to study these companies. Like, let's figure out who they are, unpack how they grow, and start to, talk about that, build a community around it, because, hey, frankly, we'd love to invest in more of these companies, and we love to help our portfolio companies, be like Slack, be like Datadog. And so that's when the term product-led growth came about back in 2016. And we've been trying to evangelize it ever since. And it's been fascinating to see it really take off, I think, in the last year or two in popularity. But it's been, a team effort. There have been so many folks. I even Mickey Allen over at Trinsic, but now part of the Gainsight family, was one of the very earliest evangelists for product-led growth. And so I don't think it would have taken off if there was one voice talking about it. It actually really required a community of folks talking about how to implement it, best practices, metrics, and that really builds a lot of confidence in helping folks scale with product-led growth.
And order of magnitude, how many companies do you think are adopting PLG in some fashion? I'm sure you guys think about this because those are probably companies you want to invest in. Do you have a sense of if it's 1,000, 100, 500? What's your best guess?
And so probably, in the thousands, if I had to guess, but I think of it more in terms of share of software companies than absolute number of companies. I know you all released data recently that showed, I believe, about half or maybe even more than half of software companies self-identify as having a product-led growth strategy.
58%, yeah.
When we look at our data from from tracking companies that we're looking at investing in, we see about 30% really have an actual PLG motion that's like up and running, and fewer than that are really all in on product-led growth as core to their strategy. And there's a lot of folks that are, kicking the tires, are still in experimentation mode. So I guess to summarize that, I'd say about maybe under a quarter of software companies are really fully bought in, but there's a ton of interest in folks that are tinkering around product-led growth.
Yeah, it's interesting because we saw this gap when we did that survey where we found 58% of companies said they have a PLG strategy, 47% plan to double their investment in PLG in the coming year, which is pretty interesting. But only 36% of those companies actually said they use data to understand their customers, which felt like a bit of a gap between maybe their aspiration on PLG and what's actually happening. Is that your read as well?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're not doing things like, having visibility into how folks use the product, looking at, hey, how to translate that into how you sell with product qualified leads, how you build products that folks are actually going to adopt, like, you're trying to, work on product led growth, but maybe you've just launched a free trial and you're not
Right.
fully bought in as an organization.
Yeah, it's funny because we asked them what stats you track, and 17% said they track time to value, 26% track activation rate, 24% track the concept of product qualified leads, like leads coming from the PLG process to your sales team. What do you think, like when you advise companies you're investing in or talking to, what metrics do you tell them to consider tracking for PLG?
Activation is my number one personally, and for a few reasons. I mean, to me, activation is a signal that you've actually delivered on the promise of your product, that you solved the pain that attracted someone to your product in the first place. And it's the core metric that growth teams, product teams should be able to move the needle on through the product experience. But it's also something that your marketing team needs to track, like really everyone in your organization needs to track. When I look at many organizations, marketing is responsible for signups, but they could spend a ton of money on signups that end up being bots or not doing anything in the product. I'd much rather have the marketing team look at activated signups, or how many folks they brought in who actually did something where they saw value in the product. And activation is so correlated with future outcomes like conversions, revenue, retention rates, that's that leading indicator metric that everyone should have a close eye on. Otherwise, I do think product qualified leads are important, but companies can really frame what a PQL means for their organization in such different ways that I find it helpful for an organization, but not the number one KPI, or just not as critical, compared to all possible KPIs. Like I've talked to companies that have said a PQL is someone who signs up for the product who is at a company with over 100 employees. It's like, well, kind of like that's probably more helpful for your sales team to call those folks than to call like anyone who signs up for your product, but still like kind of missing the point. So that's just one that it's like we're further out on. Otherwise, I also look at acquisition sources. And so product-led growth, part of the promise of it is that you're able to open up the product for a lot more people to try, experience value, and then you try to sell them, convert them to a paid customer, an enterprise customer. But you kind of have to open up the floodgates and bring in a lot of interest, a lot of signups for your product. And you generally can't spend the kind of money on acquisition that you could in a classic enterprise funnel. It's not as targeted. There's a lot more potential users in an account who could try out your product. And so you're kind of opening up a much bigger funnel as opposed to this really narrow, targeted, expensive funnel. So I look at things like how much of your signups are coming from organic sources like SEO, from product referrals, for word of mouth. That's a strong signal that you have the foundation for a PLG motion.
That makes total sense. That's really, really great. And that's the acquisition side of kind of the funnel. You alluded to the idea of PLG being relevant in retention as well. What have you seen there? How are people using PLG in retention?
So there's a few ways. One is also looking at net dollar retention rates overall. And so part of PLG is a land and expand motion where you usually start small. Maybe you convert that individual user, a team, convert a customer on a use case, or maybe if you have a usage-based pricing model, you just convert someone on a pay-as-you-go plan. And then I want to see that usage increase over time. You can get use case expansion, seed expansion, just more and more adoption over time. And so that's a huge signal for me around product-led growth. Obviously, customer success teams and other teams play a role in facilitating NDR as well. But I think product is core. And then otherwise, I look at customer health scores, which are probably like one of the most either misunderstood or misused terms out there. But trying to identify leading indicators that folks have been successful with the product and are going to stay with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so these aren't things like, hey, someone has stopped using the product for the last month. At that point, they're probably, hey, they probably already decided to churn and they're probably using another product.
Totally.
But it's things like, hey, if someone sets up an integration with Slack and they've invited 3 other people on their team and they've done X, Y, and Z other action, once someone's done those activities, you have a 95% chance of retaining them, just as an example. So I want to understand what are those leading indicators that predict customer health and be able to identify where customers are along that journey.
I love that. That's awesome. Well, it's a good segue because, what we saw an article that you wrote, I think just very recently, 11 PLG principles for the age of connected work. And actually this got forwarded around massively inside Gainsight on our Slack environment because at Gainsight, we're a big believer you need to connect your customer success, net retention efforts, your product, and your customer community together, all kind of interlaced. And you talked a little bit about the changing nature of PLG and how it's bringing in more customer community, more collaboration. So tell us a little bit about what you learned in this new rev of PLG.
Absolutely. Well, I think, when we've thought about software from a buyer perspective, we used to think of it as optional, like something that folks bought to improve KPIs and something that was bought, by an executive. I need visibility into my pipeline, right? Or I need to solve for this business process. What's happening now is that software, first of all, is just fundamental. Like every company is now a software company. Digital experiences are core. COVID drove, such significant digital transformation, but now it's, here to stay. And so I think that software as core infrastructure piece is really important. And the other piece is that end users are increasingly the kingmakers in adopting software. They adopt products that help improve their productivity or improve their workflow. They share those with folks inside their organizations and then ultimately tell their boss what to buy. So with those two trends in mind, folks need to increasingly build open products. So instead of products being walled gardens where everything is self-contained, they need to connect with all of the other products in a company's workflow to experience value. And with that in mind, I think that it's fascinating to see the rise of products that are built kind of inside of a user's context rather than forcing users to go to a new destination. So it used to be that, if you were an HR person, you went to Workday. If you were a sales rep, you went into Salesforce. Folks don't want another tool to go log into. It's actually ideal if the product just works wherever they work. And so Grammarly is a great example. Grammarly is a writing assistant. You write, in a browser, in Google Docs, in Gmail, in Outlook, in PowerPoint, everywhere. And so Grammarly sort of follows you along wherever you write and helps you improve. You're never necessarily opting for Grammarly. It's just working where you are and connected to all the systems where you need it. And so I think that concept of building for openness, built into a user's workflow, connecting with other systems, those are so critical for this new era of PLG. The other thing I'll touch on is that we've seen this rise of low code and no code, where instead of developers having to kind of be the ones who build software and customize software, or having to ask a vendor to adjust their software to kind of fit your workflow, now folks are building tools so that users, even non-technical users, have the power to adapt software to be flexible for the way they need to use it. And that's kind of turning everyday users into software developers and creators. And so because people are now creating software, they feel a lot more affinity for the brands and the products that they love, and they go to bat for those products. They're active in communities, they evangelize these products because they feel such an attachment, such a personal connection to the products. They'll also bring the products they love, the tools they've built, from job to job, company to company. And so this rise of community-led growth, I think, is just so ingrained with PLG at this point, and just is a natural extension of building for that end user.
Who are some examples of companies doing this connected work PLG model well?
There's a number of companies that we look up to. A few that I would point out are Webflow in the website building space. Obviously, Sneak in the security space. So folks historically might not have thought security products could be PLG. Sneak's proven that developers are the new end user in security, and built a really powerful kind of connected work PLG company with that in mind. And then I also look at companies like Twilio, or maybe even the OG new era of PLG company. We're doing a lot of these things really before other folks were doing it, and now the market has kind of caught up and said, hey, this is a super interesting model.
Yeah, and I think Twilio is a good example where you were talking about before, all these companies were doing these things, but there wasn't a common lingua franca on how to describe them, right? So Twilio, Slack, others, they're the real pioneers. I love it. One of the other things you talk about in the article is monetizing beyond software and kind of monetizing usage, but also beyond software. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, it's been kind of fascinating to see this kind of journey of software companies. So I think the first thing is like the monetizing on usage point. So we used to think of software as something where you needed to buy it in order to get access to it. Right. Well, now people are just using it, right? And then they'll essentially pay later. And they're going to pay once they've seen value, or if they've seen value. So you're sort of dropping that commitment. You're maybe even making there be no commitment, and trying to get folks to really see all of the great things the product has to offer, and all the different ways they can use it, all the different use cases inside of an organization. And so to me, usage-based pricing, where pricing scales directly with the amount of consumption a customer has, is just a really natural way of pricing for product-led growth, and pricing with this idea of like, let's give users the tools, let's allow them to use all the features they want. And if they ultimately aren't seeing the results and they stop using it, they'll stop paying. And if we improve the product, we drive even more value, more benefits for them, they'll pay us even more as a result. But it's win-win because they're seeing more value from the product. And so I think of PLG and usage-based pricing as super intertwined. But then there's also this kind of new set of companies that are monetizing beyond software, as you had pointed out, where software, the edges of what's software and what's not software are increasingly blurry. Like at Toast, they might offer software to manage a restaurant's workflows, but that extends into payment processing for customers. That might extend to helping your customers set up online ordering. They might have integrations with DoorDash to allow customers to do delivery, and they might enable marketing so that their customers can help find more new customers. They might even have capital financial services offerings like lending or other financial products that a restaurant might need to get off the ground. All of a sudden, it's really unclear like what is software and what you should pay for as like a subscription software cost, and what's just, hey, Toast taking some interchange fees, or taking a margin on processing the financial service. And so I think of it increasingly as like, what would happen if a competitor came in and offered the software for free and monetized it a different way? And could they start taking share, taking more of your customers? And so for companies listening to this, don't be hopefully too scared by this, but do think about ways to extend your product to really solve for your customers' workflow problems, because the customer doesn't necessarily know or care about like what software versus not software. That's a sort of distinction, but not a difference. They just care about having their problems solved and being able to grow their business.
I love that. And it's interesting because PLG, then having a low cost way to bring people into your product allows you to do things like make it free to start and then monetize in lots of other ways. If you had the traditional model of selling and onboarding a customer, you could never be that disruptive, right? Is that the connection to PLG?
Absolutely.
PLG, yeah.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. All right, well, let's close out. I always like to do word association at the end, so we have some things for people to remember. So if I'll say a phrase, you just tell me first thing that comes to mind. Product-led growth.
Building for the user.
For the user. All right, that's great. Something for us to all remember. Customer success. I have to always ask that one. Customer success. What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Making sure your users are successful.
There you go. It's the user is the key part of that, right? Valuations.
Valuations. Ugh.
Is that
That's a tough one right now. Valuation. It's a build a company that creates value for your customers, and valuations will follow.
Yeah, that's right. Value. It's the value for the customers where it all starts. That's great. All right. I don't know if you've seen the show Ted Lasso. Does that bring anything into mind?
It does. A word association on Ted Lasso. I just think going back to customer success, winning is a team sport. It takes everyone, and we each bring our own kind of perspectives and skills to the table, and that's how you build something that's going to ultimately be enduring.
Well, that was a shameless plug because August 17th, 18th, we have our Pulse conference in San Francisco for product managers, for customer success people, community leaders. And we'll have Jason Sudeikis, the star of Ted Lasso, there on stage, and I get to interview him.
That's a good get.
I'll do the mic drop at the end, and I think I'll just end my career at that point. That I couldn't get any better. So hopefully, Kyle, you can make it. I know it's been amazing collaborating with the OpenView folks over the years. Love what you're doing. For folks that are watching this, make sure you check out the OpenView Ventures blog. So much to learn from them, and really appreciate you spending time with us, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Nick.
Awesome. Have a great day.